Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and speak with you about my research. It's really exciting to see buy-in from the emergency services. It's almost been 10 years now since I started this work in Australia, and it's so exciting to see the momentum that's being picked up in terms of how gender is now being viewed and the awareness. So I'm really happy to be here today. The reason why I'm here today, part of the reason is this book that was published last year that I wrote, that I spent 7 years doing research for, which is a comparative study of Australia and the US West Coast in terms of both how people prepare and respond to fires, but also looking much more widely about the embedded norms in society that means that either at a household level, a community, or at a management and policy level, we think and act in certain ways and the implications of that. Now, to set the scene for my talk today, I'm going to rewind the clock to 2011 because the events of that day raised emotions in me that became the catalyst for writing a chapter in my book about how women variously toe the line or break the glass ceiling within bushfire management and firefighting. So it's a particular case study, and then I'll elaborate more with other case studies. But to start off, pop psychology, it's a term that's used in public discourse, and it's almost like an obsession, that where we label gender differences as if these differences are biologically set in stone, and we've talked about this morning. It's almost like Western society has this captivation with dividing men and women into groups, and that has really problematic outcomes when in leadership debates, men and women are portrayed as being incapable of getting along because of the way they communicate are too different. And I was witness to this very scenario at a community engagement and fire awareness conference that was hosted by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service for 400 odd staff and volunteers in 2011. The much publicised keynote speaker was Alan Pease. He's the co-author of books such as Why Men Lie and Women Cry, Why Men Don't Have a Clue and Women Always Needs More Shoes, and Why Men Don't Listen and Women Can't Read Maps. Now, during the hour-long keynote on different communication styles of men and women, I watched a room packed to the rafters with mainly male firefighters enthralled and captivated by Alan Pease's vigorous body language and his entertaining PowerPoint slides, which reinforced biologically deterministic gender stereotyping to an extent that left me feeling nauseous. What intrigued me, however, was the way in which his argument was of biologically determined gender differences was so compelling to the enrapt audience. Why was I so surprised by their uncritical agreement? The firefighting profession, as well as the rural hinterland from which the rural fire services traditionally draw the majority of its volunteers, are deeply embedded in testosterone-fueled patriarchal structured system that place many, if not most, female volunteers and staff in the logistical and care providing roles that are associated with women in traditional rural landscapes. It angered me that Alan Pease would disguise his argument in so-called scientific proof mangled from biological and evolutionary theories of Stone Age behaviour, which have been substantially disproved by rigorous feminist sociological and cultural studies. To the non-academic, male-dominated crowd in attendance at the conference, however, the argument of a fixed gender dichotomy in human life or character was compelling, as it confirmed their culturally defined masculine rights. The talk was providing all the proof needed to not make an effort to accommodate women within the patrilineal stronghold of the firefighting tradition and emergency management more broadly. Because the ways in which men and women think, feel and communicate are, according to Alan Pease and his books, biologically determined, permanent, and irreconcilable. Standing in the back row of the conference auditorium, I was emphatically reminded that the hegemonic masculinity in our society is alive and well today. The biologically deterministic core argument performed on stage fitted squarely with the cultural norms that continue to challenge equal opportunities for women and men in emergency management. So this event became the catalyst for some of my book writing because it further opened my eyes to the gendered norms that are so embedded in our everyday lives that we rarely notice them. And if we do notice them, we often don't really know what to do with them. And we've heard lots of examples today during the group work. What became clear to me, though, is that gender was everywhere in the research I was doing, from households to fire managers to Aboriginal elders alike. Initially, it did truly surprise me how both men and women consistently upheld to me conventional views of bushfire management as men's business in their narratives of both living and working with fire. And this description by a female participant of firefighting men as mythologized heroes is indicative of how the agency of bushfire over time has helped shape cultural identity. And she's saying the mythical building up of the bushfire volunteer, it's very important that we always have that mythical icon. It has to be male. We cannot have, women bake the scones and sell them to raise money, but we must have that icon. Bushfire always gives us that. However, what became increasingly clear to me during the 7 years of study that went into this book is how both women and men suffer from structural biases when it comes to household decision-making, social constructions of gender, and gendered aspects of agencies that manage fire. And before I go any further, I'm going to do a bit of a 101 of what we did this morning, but in the context of my study, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of some key definitions. First, and this is what we went through this morning about the difference between equity and equality. And I've put a shorter description up here than what was given this morning of what the difference is. So equity is concerned with moral justice and rights, whereas equality concerns the conditions of being equal, sameness, and evenness. And this is important, and I'll come back to it towards my end of my talk to show you a very concrete example of why it is it's important. And I just included a quote at the bottom here that I read this morning as I was on the train on the way out here about how equality might level the playing field, but it doesn't actually do anything to improve the field itself. And that's important as well when we think about how we work towards a more equitable workforce. Definition I would like to clarify is that of gender. So again, going right back to 101. But if there's one thing that I would like to achieve with my work is for everyone to recognize gender not in terms of gender differences, but in terms of gender relations. So gender is a matter of social relations, i.e. social structures with enduring or widespread patterns rather than an expression of a dichotomous biology. And I've included a quote here by Reverend Cornell, who for several decades now have been looking mainly at masculinities in workplace structures. And what Reverend Cornell says is, we cannot think of womanhood or manhood as fixed by nature, but neither should we think of them as simply imposed from outside by social norms or pressure from authorities. People construct themselves as masculine or feminine. We claim a place in the gender order or respond to the place we have been given by the way we conduct ourselves in everyday life. And that I have found is very much what happens in emergency management and particularly within the firefighting profession. So why is it important to consider gender in emergency management? Well, it matters for three key reasons in my research. First of all, the findings in my studies show that gender matters in emergency management because gendered norms structure women's and men's level of risk tolerance and actions in ways that negate the otherwise changing social circumstances in places where rural and urban lifestyles intermix. And Craigiebone is the perfect example of this. We have lots of housing estates being built in what would have been a fire-prone area, still is a fire-prone area, and the people moving in are not your traditional rural occupants. It also matters because even when stated policy appears gender aware, institutions reproduce the prevailing values in society more often than they challenge them. And the power dynamics in mixed settings are generally disadvantageous to women. So we've heard lots of statistics this morning of how that unfolds in the workplace, but it also really speaks to how we today are sitting here discussing ways to do this, but actually taking that back to our workplace is a very different matter altogether. And thirdly, it matters because most institutions are gendered, with internal gender relations within wider context, all of which produce gender effects. And there's a quote here again by Raymond Cornell, and it's particularly the latter half I'd like you to pay attention to. What she's saying is, without even being named as gender, a socially defined masculinity may be built in to the very concept of management or organisational rationality. We don't even notice that it's happening. And the way that we view the world is traditionally seen from a male perspective. So given these 3 points, it is rather extraordinary that through the ebb and flow of public and agency debates over how to solve the problem of bushfire at the interface between the city and beyond, the role of bushfire in moulding up holding gender roles within Australian society has rarely been discussed. And the AFAC's position statement on bushfire and community safety is a key case in point. It doesn't mention gender at all. It is increasingly recognised in scholarly research internationally that women and men are exposed to risk in different ways at different levels because of the everyday gendered division of labour, the distribution of power, and thus decision-making processes domestically, locally and officially. Gendered norms also underpin intended and actual patterns of disaster preparedness and response. While gendered dimensions of bushfire on the surface often appear to make women more vulnerable, what my work is showing is that it increases the vulnerability of men to bushfire just as much. And that is because of the activities that men and women tend to perform before, during and after a disaster. And these gendered structures frame bushfire management in Australia. They are deeply ingrained in operational procedures and norms, posing both physical and mental challenges for women who seek to gain recognition as competent firefighters, as well as for men who strive to fulfill public demands for heroic forms of masculinity. Challenges materialise, for example, in the form of the language and culture of male-dominated brigades, which deter many women from getting involved. Critical health challenges can also materialise when masculine urges to protect and control, or male efforts to uphold symbolic representations of manliness, result in suppression of emotional distress, for example through isolated behaviour, overwork or excessive alcohol intake. What is interesting is that at first thought, many of the men and women that have been part of my research express a belief that gender inequality is an issue of the past that has been overcome by a general generational shift within society and emergency services more broadly. And upon greater reflection, that normally turns out, or in most cases turns out not to be the case. And it's much more complex. And this is because the many advances for women worldwide during the past 5 decades have been uneven, meaning that prejudice and sexism remain firmly embedded in social structures, although often in sort of a latent and disguised in equal opportunity policies. And I've included a couple of 3 slides of some data that literally is so hot off the press I haven't even had a chance to look at it properly yet. But I was approached by the Association for Fire Ecology towards the end of last year to do a survey of the wildland firefighting profession internationally of gender discrimination and sexual harassment. And by saying the wildland fire profession generally, that's everything from firefighters to fire management to fire researchers to students within particular context. And I will just draw some very basic data from it in this case. But initially I looked at this question and I thought, well, how many of these organizations have actually, or the people who participated in the study, which was about 400, how many have seen concrete examples of their workplace doing something to make it more equitable and to address particular discrimination and harassment issues? And 67% said that they've seen that. That's very encouraging, great. When you then actually look at the level of experience, whether it's the observation of others being harassed or discriminated against, or whether it's personal experience, my heart started sinking, because you see that over 50% of respondents had experienced, had observed discrimination of others, or about 45% had personally experienced it. When you go to the actual observation of sexual harassment or personally experienced sexual harassment, we still see that a third and a quarter of the workforce have experienced this. Like, that's a lot. When we think about our workplace, that's too many. And it gets even more disheartening when you look at how many of these events are actually reported. Of the people who had observed discrimination, only 13% said that it had been reported. 19% had been reported if it was a case of personal discrimination. And we see a slightly higher level of reportage for actual harassment cases, but still, it's low. It tells us something about the system and how it's set up to support these people when occurrences of harassment and discrimination takes place. And the next step in my job is to start looking at what it is people are telling us in this survey, the reasons why they didn't report it. So to return to the points 2 and 3 of why gender matters in emergency management, and given the data I've just given you, the ways in which gender regimes are firmly embedded in social structures is reflected in the persistence of gender order within the patriarchal structures of the firefighting agencies, within the people who are experiencing this where they work. And this is linked both to the invisible and visible resistance to change, which is encountered not only amongst many male firefighters, but also by the system. And to clarify what I mean by this, I'm going to resort to a quote by Bob Pease, who many of you will know, who does some wonderful work on privilege and masculinities. And it's a quote that gets to, I've just included the key point from it here, but what Bob talks about is the importance of engaging with what he terms the uncharted and latent terrain of male privilege. So I'll read you a quote. I believe that too much attention has been focused on the responsibility of those who are oppressed, and too little attention has been given to those in privileged groups reproduce inequality. Part of the problem is that it is very difficult to get the issue of privilege on the agenda because it is so well legitimated. Privilege is not recognized as such by many of those who have it. Privilege appears to be natural, therefore it is necessary to unmask privilege and make it more visible so its consequences can be addressed. And that's very much the case within the emergency services. We need to start looking at the ways that we approach different issues and the men and women who deal with these issues. And that gets to the point that the unmasking of privilege is, of course, a two-way street. It applies to men and women alike. Privilege, ironically, though, is part and parcel of the male urge to care and protect for women. And while such protective behaviour can be gentlemanly and chivalrous, and it is also strongly linked to a sense of male authority and the perceived weakness of the female physique, such as strength and menstruation, and women's psychological characteristics, such as crying. The challenges many women face when they strive to gain recognition for their firefighting competencies are therefore often a result of subliminal behaviour by men who in theory condone equal opportunities in the workplace but have never questioned the way in which their own behaviour reproduces inequalities and sexism. In 2013, for example, the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, their aviation specialists, 91% of those were men. It just shows the way in which the progression of staff is not equal. However, the practice of promotion is not just gender biased, it sustains the symbolic imagery of physically strong heterosexual outdoorsy men as real firefighters. And it also usually restricted to men who present themselves in this way. So this comes back to how we actually accept our level of order within the gender order and how we behave accordingly. So this is like a venerable rural myth of rugged individualism, defines the standard of competence, which is valued highest within the male-dominated world of firefighting. What it also shows is that boys' clubs can be as exclusive to men as it is to women, as the enactment of privileged masculinities not only enable most men to dominate women, it also enables some men to dominate other men. Men can be as constrained by hegemonic forms of masculinity as women, as they navigate the representations of manliness versus the lived realities of socially constructed, historically situated, invisible and multiple forms of masculinities. And as voiced by this National Parks Ranger, there can be distinct advantages to being a woman. What she's saying is, I've always felt it's an advantage to be a woman. It feels like you're playing it both ways somehow. If you're a male ranger dealing with field officers, there's certain expectations of them which is probably as difficult to deal with as maybe the lack of expectations of the females. Now, I'm not sure she defines that as being an advantage. I wouldn't say having lack of expectation is an advantage, but what it really does show is that it's a two-way game, and that both men and women have to negotiate these social constructions that we have put around them. Achieving equitable inequality is a complex task, though, even when men are taken out of the gender equation, as pregnancy and motherhood pose a whole other set of challenges for equity and equality amongst female firefighters, and I'm going to give you a few examples of that next. So this is a quote by a battalion chief in California, and she describes how her personal torment in coming to terms with her career and sexuality. So she joined the firefighting force in the 1980s, and she's saying, when I decided to make this profession my career, I cried, because at that point in time, every woman who got pregnant or got married left the profession. Then I had to deal personally with accepting that I was gay. That was a whole other crying moment, because it's like, okay, I choose a profession over what society says you have to have, family. With time, neither the career choice nor the sexuality of this lady has prevented her from having both a successful career as a firefighter or a family life with children. Her story speaks volumes, though, to the social pressures to which both women and men conform. While women today no longer automatically leave the workforce or are forced to leave the workforce when they become pregnant or they get married, the odds are still stacked against female firefighters who are also mothers. And this relates both to the gendered structures of society, which conceal how gender roles are taken for granted, and the invisible patriarchal norms that shape organizational policy and practice. So to one female firefighter, women as the minority in firefighting is a very simple gender equation. She's saying it's mostly men because there are not enough of us, because we've all had babies, and then you go backwards. My husband, his life has hardly changed, so I still know my place as a woman at work and in the family. And what this talks to is how, despite all the women liberations movements and the affirmative action programs and equal opportunity policies of firstly the 80s and then the 90s, despite all of that, and how that's carved out a role for women within emergency management and firefighting, it is remarkable that the triple role of women, so reproduction, production and community activism is still seen as a woman's problem today. And it's a very prominent theme within the narratives of the female firefighters in my study. The correlation is not straightforward though. Rather, the firefighting mothers I interviewed can be seen as fitting into three categories. For some women, the notion of going backwards is purely perceived in a professional sense. It's an involuntary setback in career aspirations caused by mandatory training programs, arduous fitness tests, or required hours on the fire line that are difficult or often impossible to meet for mothers who simultaneously are the primary carers for their children. Of course, that also applies to men who are their primary carers and how they simply cannot get enough hours on the fire line to qualify for the training that's required to be on the fire line in the first place, and therefore it's this cycle that they can't get out of. For other women, it's also a setback in self-esteem that can lead to unhappiness and resentment. For some women, however, it's not so much a setback as a conscious choice to step back from some firefighting duties as their priorities change with pregnancy or after giving birth. And this is in part due to a heightened sense of mortality with motherhood. So this particular lady is talking about how she was so full of that, well, this is not going to change my life. I'm going to be pregnant, I'll have this child, and I'll keep going. And she says, towards the end there in the quote, she's saying, well, if anything has happened to my son, I would never have forgiven myself. But at the time, that was all I could think of. Out there on the fire line, pop out the baby, keep going. The third and final group of mothers in my study who have battled on with their career regardless of the challenges imposed by motherhood, their heightened sense of mortality and the testosterone-fueled work environment. And I've included a couple of quotes here to show both the passion that drives them, but also the battle scars that comes from driving their aspirations. And the first lady here is saying it's cultural, it's about people's views about what women should do at certain times in their menstrual cycle or when they're reproducing or when they're breastfeeding. That present challenges but not insurmountable ones. So she's aware of it, but she's not letting it stop her. The second quote here is from another female firefighter who talks about how it's fairly intense, and it always was fairly intense, going away to fires, working incredible shifts, and going home to 2 young children. And I asked her, well, how did you manage? And she kind of laughed and said, yeah, well, not very well. But she said, you do it, but it was pretty exhausting, and certainly my son was weaned as a result of me going to a fire. There's been plenty of times I've said I can't go and put the family first, but I didn't think of not having children because of the firefighting side of things. So these examples, going back to the definition I gave at the beginning of gender, gender arrangements within firefighting agencies are reproduced socially, not biologically, by the power of structures to shape individual actions so they appear unchanging. And it's a quote down at the bottom here that says, women didn't choose to earn less money, bias does that. Nor did they choose to be the primary caregivers, socialization does that. It's just in the way that society is set up. Both men and women suffer from structural biases when it comes to decision-making processes, the social constructions of gender and gendered aspects of the agencies that they work for. The challenges for female firefighters is not to stumble into the old tracks, the old way of doing things, when they're straying onto what is perceived to be the male terrain of firefighting or other emergency services. Because the resilience of structures of inequality lies precisely in their ability to accommodate new contexts. And that's a very interesting point. Every time we change the context to make it more equitable, the definition of what it means to be a man and what it means to do this or that changes. The challenge for male firefighters, on the other hand, is to question the ways in which their own behaviour unintentionally reproduce inequalities, ageism and sexism. And this is where I come back to the difference between equity and equality. I would argue that firefighters and emergency management more broadly should continue to strive for affirmative action, but with an emphasis on gender equity rather than equality. Equity equates to women becoming like men, whereas equity is respectful of difference. I can't tell you the amount of times in the interviews I do where women believe that they have to be like a man, because by becoming one of the boys, acceptance is granted by reproducing the hegemony of firefighting masculinities and all of its inequalities. And in that way, what my research paints is a really bleak picture of gender equality. Because of the pre-existing subordinate position in society, that distinction has to be made between equity and equality. And this follows the argument of equitable inequalities that reflect the needs and strength and relative power of the various groups, rather than equality amongst groups of people. Achieving equitable inequalities is a challenging task, given that firefighters' bodies are embedded in diverse and competing gender discourses, not only around practices of risk and leadership, but also with practices of parenting and care. That said, institutions can start to destabilise the gender dimensions by officially sanctioning messages about firefighting that troubles how bodies, danger and risk become gendered. And that's not just within institutions, but media more broadly, and how we reproduce the notion of men as hero and women as victims. An important part of this story is how training to become a firefighter requires negotiating alternative discourses around bodies, such as technique and fitness over physical strength and aggression. So how, when a technical firefighter, a really competent technical firefighter, can outcompete even the strongest of their male firefighting colleagues. Any alternative discourse will also need to consider how firefighters and firefighting capacities are rewarded through mentoring programs rather than gendered relation of networks of mates, which is what has traditionally been the case. And these ideas are expressed by participants in my study. So these are ideas that already exist within the workforce. And what they do is they point to possibilities to assist with gender equality in the lives of firefighters. And I'll finish off just with a quote here, because it really shows the magic of what lies behind gendered facades and when we are allowed to just be who we are rather than what society deems we should be. So this lady is saying she had this fantastic moment out in the hazard reduction burn. They'd been working really hard and it'd been really quite difficult. They all sat down to have lunch and she said, "I'd made some biscuits, so I got the biscuits out and I passed them around." One of the blokes went, "Is this a jam drop recipe? How did you get the hundreds and thousands on top?" We started having this discussion about baking biscuits and they were telling me their biscuit recipes. It was just the most bizarre experience, sitting there in the bush with these blokes telling me their recipes. So it just goes to show that there's lots of room for equity and equality within our organisations. It's all about how society is set up to make us behave in certain ways. Now I'll finish off there, but if you're interested in knowing more about my work, I have written several blog posts about this particular topic, and you're also very welcome to contact me. Thank you.